Good evening. About 4 months ago, I made this video here, which deals with the idle speed adjustment tutorial part 6. And in that particular video, I explained on how to, theoretically, on following the manual, on how to adjust the plate, which is for the resting point and the play. This is the group 7.3, and that would be document 245. And I had followed the instructions here, basically, which goes right here. It says here that the, let me get this positioned here a little bit better. The zero position of sensor plate, the upper edge of the sensor plate must be flush with the upper edge of the cylindric part. That's this part up here. And a maximum of 0.2 millimeters permissible. The whole thing, which has created some confusion, in this position, a clearance of 1 to 2 millimeters should exist when pushing the sensor plate up to the control piston. What that actually means is, that means when you're pushing the plate actually down by 1 to 2 millimeters, there should be a minute gap here, because this is not a one-to-one translation. This thing does not move by 1 millimeter here when you push the plate down by 1 millimeter. The gap is very, very small. It is probably 1/10 of a millimeter or so when you have a 1 millimeter play in here. And again, this is adjusted with your throttle mixture. And now one viewer had pointed this out. He had a 500E, I believe, a later model in 92 and 93, which still utilizes the KE Jetronic with the system. And he had a hard time getting this started with the 1 to 2 millimeter play in it. And I want to explain this on what this actually means, when it is applicable, when you should have play and when you should not have a play. I should have done this in this video. But let's go to a part we're very familiar with. This here is a picture of one of the idle speed control valves I had bought and tested, and this was before I had replaced some of my stuff. This is just an archive picture I have exactly of the position we want to be on. Now, the vacuum is created on the right hand side of for the idle speed and starting, is created on the right hand side of the idle speed control valve. This is a little bypass piece which always will apply a certain amount of vacuum even when this is fully closed. And this right angled connector here connects to the bottom of the boot, which is mounted below the air plate, which is here, this part here. So this actually sits here in this position. Whoops, what are we doing here? There we go. Sits over here, and it sucks the air through the vacuum from here, through the idle speed control valve out to all 8 cylinders on these cups, on these holders for the injector seats. That's the 4 hoses you got there, which combines this, the one which sits on each one of the cups, so injector holders basically, and then the 2 connecting hoses which bring this to the idle speed control valve. And now the first thing is, on an aging car, well, let me start this in a different way. When this manual was written, or when those manuals were written, these cars were brand new, okay? And on a brand new car, you can set this up with 1 to 2 millimeters play before the piston is activated. That means you have to have an X amount of vacuum to move 1 or 2 millimeters down, and then you will have to have even more vacuum to start pushing the piston up. This is the ideal situation when it is a brand new engine, where everything is new, pistons, I mean everything, and you have full vacuum when you crank the engine over. Then this will work. As the engine ages, you will lose vacuum because the valves seats are not good anymore. The valve's starting to leak, and the pistons are not compressing and creating as much vacuum than once they were new, and that sort of stuff. You have to take this into consideration. And the reason why I'm showing you this picture here is there's a very simple test you can do, is by removing this little connecting piece here, that pipe, or that tube, that PVC tube, and then insert a PVC tube in here with a vacuum gauge attached and another vacuum gauge attached on the side. This here will be your vacuum when you start and idle, as it comes from that is basically the unregulated, the raw vacuum. And this side is the regulated vacuum controlled by the idle speed control valve. And what you will do then is this side will measure the exact vacuum as the plate here is experiencing while it is being pulled down. And you will see on how much raw vacuum you actually got when the engine is cranking, and I will get to that in a second, and then when you're idling. Make sure that both ports are closed off, that there's no leaks on them, and you have to have two hoses attached. You can then see the difference in inch mercury between each side, and you know on how much the ICV actually is open or closed. If both gauges show the same amount of vacuum, this valve is fully open. If you have a higher vacuum here than on this side, then you know that your idle speed control valve is closing. It's closing itself off. It is limiting the vacuum exposed to the plate and the amount of fuel which is going to flow. Now, in order to evaluate an older engine, and I'm talking, I would say starting point either 75,000 miles on it and no rebuild basically, or rebuild after 75,000 miles in 10 years. That's when you need to perform this test. And this will give you an idea on how much vacuum you actually got. The first thing you do is you connect these two vacuum hoses, take this out, you connect the two tubes in here, shorter tubes with the vacuum gauges on them. Then you remove the fuel pump relay and you disconnect the crank position sensor. So your engine won't start when you crank it, and you won't flood the engine because the relay, the fuel pump relay, is removed. So you're not actually pumping any fuel into this. All you want to know is how much vacuum am I actually having when I crank. When you do this test, make sure that your battery is fully charged, not just a little bit with one of them booster packs. Go in and fully charge your battery, and then you have to think about it. How old is my starter? If it is a fairly new starter or a starter in mint condition, you will get better cranking RPM out of it. As older the starter get, you may not get as much RPM out of it. A new starter in a fairly decent system should be able to rev up the engine with the cranking, with the spark plugs installed, so full compression in it, without fuel flow and without ignition, to about 400 to 425 RPM. That is just for informational purposes. And it is basically at that information, what you need is that that 425 RPM or thereabouts, that's when you need to know on how much vacuum you actually got. And it would be interesting if someone performs this test, if you could leave a comment below this video and report to us what vacuum did you measure, raw side and regulated side, and how old is, when was the last rebuild of the engine, was it original engine, mileage, and that sort of stuff, and the car you actually got. You can do this for any of these vehicles. And we will get then an idea on how the vacuum actually gets less and less and deteriorates, the vacuum production of the engine over time and mileage. And that's the point now where we have to look with the plate. As less vacuum the engine produces when it ages and due to mileage, is less of a gap you want to have here between that ball unit or the roller back here, which has to be in a rolling. That thing is absolutely critical that it has 3 wheels and also the 2 needle bearings on each side, that this unit moves absolutely freely with no friction in it. That is important. If you have any friction in the system, it's going to be difficult to do anything. And this is all done after you have adjusted the resting point as explained in the other videos. So what you want to do now is older your engine gets, is more likely you're going to have to be to a 0 play. And what they're actually saying with this 1 to 2 millimeter play, when you read the Bosch documentation, the Bosch Jetronic documentation, I do not have it in English here, is that the play will be created simply by the fact that every time you turn off the engine, whenever that plate moves down, that counterweight moves up in the opposite direction. Besides of pushing the piston in, that counterweight moves up. So now when you turn the engine physically off, that counterweight comes down and the piston drives that down too, and it will actually bang against the resting pin. And if you do this 10,000 times, over 10 years, 1,000 starts and stops on an engine per year, 3 times a day. If you drive a lot, you go to the stores, you go to 3-4 different stores a day. You do that a while. You do that 1,000 times over 10 years. That pin, that resting pin, will be hammered in the up direction. And that will automatically introduce a gap or a play to begin with on these new vehicles. So this is something you have to experiment with. And like I said, I would do the vacuum test here on these 2 ports and see what that is. From my experience on the older engines, on the new engines, you're probably having about 18-inch mercury here on the raw side at 425 RPM when the thing is fully cranking. And this is going to be, on this side, is going to be either the same, a 17-18-inch mercury, or it's going to be less depending on where the position is, how the idle speed control unit has regulated it. Usually during cranking, when the idle speed control unit gets the ignition key start signal, it usually opens this thing fully up. And so you should measure, actually, both vacuums should be equal right at that point during cranking. If they're not, then that means that your idle speed control valve no longer fully opens up, and you either have to clean it out or you have to get a new valve, depending on the circumstances, if that is what the condition is of the valve. Or you can adjust then the spring, which will push that further back, and it will give that more air, more vacuum here. Like I said, at 425 RPM, you should see the same, at cranking, you should see the same vacuum on both sides, and that should be on a new engine, rebuilt engine, approximately 18-inch mercury. On an old engine, like on my engine, I'm around 14-inch mercury. So this is about the difference, 4, 5, 6-inch mercury, depending. And my engine is in a pretty decent shape. It could go maybe all the way down to 10-inch mercury, on a really bad engine, on an old engine which hasn't been rebuilt, and then valves are leaking and everything's out of whack and this, that, and the other thing. But that gives you a starting point. And my car, I have tried both. I have used it with the clearance after adjusting the plate, where I had the 1 to 2 millimeter play in it, and I have done it without any play. And that means that this part here, basically the roller touches the piston, but when the plate is at resting point, but it does not allow any fuel flow yet. So you want to crack one of your fuel lines open when you do this, and at that point you want to bridge actually the the fuel pump relay on terminal 7 and 8 to have fuel pressure there. And you want this just resting on there, that there's no fuel flow. And if you press this then down by 1 millimeter, you want to have a fuel flow. This way you can compensate this on an older engine. On a brand new engine, you may get too much fuel in there because the vacuum is much higher, and then you may need the 1 to 2 millimeter play before. That means there has to be an X amount of vacuum is eaten up just by free play, and then it hits the piston, and then you have a flow. This relationship between the plate and the piston will determine on how much fuel is actually injected, and that's basically your mixture control. And so if you have a rather large play on there, then you're going to be too lean when you start. And if you bring it up too high or too far, you could have probably constant fuel flow, what you don't really want. So you want to be right at zero fuel flow when this touches, or a little bit below. And that really depends only on one thing, and that is the quality of the vacuum produced by the engine. That really sets the stage for this whole thing. And I hope that this has now explained this of what you need to do. Remember, the manuals are usually applied or valid or used by Mercedes-Benz primarily the first 4 years to 8 years when they come out with a new model, because the most Mercedes-Benz owners who purchase the car new, they usually drive the car 1 to 3 years. That is the average time, and then they sell them. And they buy a new one. So a lot of the stuff is under warranty, when they have problems, and otherwise it is just regular service, and these things don't come really into perspective. These cars may get 20, 40, 50,000 miles, 60,000 miles on it. Some of them may come up in 2-3 years to 100,000 miles, but that would be rather an exception. So you have to keep that in mind. These manuals were primarily written for Mercedes-Benz service technicians who also received training, by instructors on those particular models in conjunction with these manuals, plus the table books, plus the addendums, and plus other supplements you probably don't have available. So because something is written in a Mercedes-Benz manual, that does not mean that you have the entire picture of it. Even if you have done a 3-year apprenticeship at Mercedes-Benz, or 3.5-year apprenticeship as we don't say car mechanics anymore, I guess car technician, or electronic car technician for the electronics. They got now, I guess, 2 jobs in that, what used to be 1. Even those people receive ongoing training, which is on top of the repair manuals, service manuals, addendums, table books, and God knows what else, plus video instructions on how to do something. So there's a whole assortment available, and this is, say, like the manuals itself is probably a 35% out of the entire information available. And it is possible that something printed in here, which was used at a particular time when a model was in a certain age range, like from 0 days brand new to 3-4 years, those issues to repair or the symptoms which can occur may not be even in the manual, and that's where the experience comes in, and the classroom knowledge from the Mercedes-Benz technicians, which is not publicly available, and you can't really download anywhere because it is not written. That is word of mouth, that is training, and that is something where you have to rely on those people you work with of the experience they have. I can pass on my experience I have with my vehicle, which I have tested or not tested, and I can report to you what is working and what is not working, contrary to what the manual says. And in my case, with the 334,200 miles I got on there now, engine being rebuilt in 2007, partially rebuilt with the heads redone and a couple pistons exchanged, so that's about 125,000 miles or so ago. For me, at my current situation with the overall condition my engine is in, I fare better starting and running when I have zero play, but I have no fuel flow. That means the roller making contact to the piston, and that is the same experience the fellow in the United Kingdom had who left the messages on that part number 6 video of the series with his 500E, I believe, a 92 or 93 500E. I'm not mentioning his name. You can read the comments if you want, because I have not asked him for permission to name him in here, but I wanted to point this out. So, and with this, you have a great evening. Don't be afraid to ask any questions, or if something confuses you because I said something in one video that way and in the other video it might be somewhat contradicting itself. I'm trying to be as clear as I can, but these are all very complex things, and there's usually not one particular answer which fits every problem. So you have to really understand there's so many factors coming into this on what is appropriate at one point. And in this particular instance, I wanted to point this out for clarification. You have a great night.